everybody, and welcome to another ASMR video here on the channel. Now in tonight's video, I have for you the very last scary Reddit story video of the year. I just wanted to take this intro to say thank you for the incredible support on these videos over the previous year. Like, coming into this year, they were always popular and did well views-wise, comments-wise, but you guys have really stepped it up this year even more and engaged even more. And there will definitely be plenty more videos next year, as long as these Reddit threads never die. I will never stop doing them, and there'll be plenty of scary story live streams as well next year. So we've got that to look forward to. So, to kind of round off the year, I thought it would be a good idea to do a kind of 2024 roundup video. So I've got a number of stories I've ordered the past year by highest rated, so these are the best scary stories from 2024. So hopefully you enjoy there. Upon first glance, I don't think there's actually too many repeats. I think there might be a couple from previous videos, but likelihood is you might have forgotten them. But if you recognise a story and don't want to hear it again, I'll leave the timestamps down below. So thank you once again for the support, and let's get into scary story number 1. We begin with this. I thought my boyfriend was the love of my life until I discovered he was drugging me at night. Lately I've been waking up still exhausted. Even if I went to bed early, I'd wake up feeling like I haven't slept in days. Trying to get out of bed for work was almost impossible, which was strange for me because I was always a high energy sort of person. A few hours of sleep and I was always good to go. I was at a loss as to what was happening, and after a barrage of tests, even my doctor couldn't find anything wrong with me. The only recent change in my life was my boyfriend, who had moved in, and I was sharing a bed for the first time in my life. Stephen was the first love of my life, and this was my first serious relationship. I didn't want to spoil things by making him sleep in the spare room. I liked having Stephen around. He made a real fuss over me, and he would bring me chamomile tea every night before bed. The pain in my hip was sharp and pulsated up the right side of my body. I jumped from my bed and nearly collapsed to the floor as I struggled to get to the bathroom. "Stephen, can you get in here?" I cried. A big, dark bruise covered my hip, as if I was assaulted in my sleep with a metal bar. "What's wrong?" Stephen said as he came rushing into the bathroom. "Did I fall out of bed or something?" I said. Stephen had a weird expression on his face. I could swear he looked guilty about something. "Probably, I don't know." His response was dismissive, which sent my brain spiralling with all sorts of thoughts. "This is not normal, Stephen. I think there's something wrong with me." "You should probably see a doctor then," he said coldly before quickly leaving the bathroom. My doctor was still at a loss and suggested I should see someone who could rule out anything nefarious. Stephen was still dismissive of me as we drove to the hospital. "I'm sure it's nothing, you're probably just stressed from work." People don't wake up with bruises over stress, I angrily thought to myself. The doctor at the hospital took my blood felt like I was losing my mind. Something was definitely wrong with me. I would prescribe you sedatives, but your blood work shows you are already on nitrazepam, explained the doctor. I was dumbstruck and wasn't sure what the doctor was talking about. I have never taken so much as a painkiller in my life. The doctor's face looked how I felt. He took out his charts and looked over them again. No, you definitely tested positive for nitrazepam, which is a powerful sedative. Later that evening, as I sat in bed, a million different thoughts ran through my head. How was that even possible? I thought to myself. As I sat there, Stephen walked in with my chamomile tea, and just as I was about to put it to my lips, I was struck by the most unnerving thought. The realization that my boyfriend was drugging me hit me like a ton of bricks, and filled me with a dread I had never felt before. I emptied the contents of the cup down the sink in the bathroom before jumping back into bed. Was it hot enough for you? Asked Stephen as he jumped into bed beside me. Perfect as always, I said. I felt as if I was lying beside a complete stranger. Had I ever really known him? I thought to myself as I lay there terrified. He was doing unimaginable things to me while I slept. I must have drifted off at some stage, because when I woke up the room was a mess and Stephen was nowhere to be seen. My body ached all over and it felt like I was in a fight. What the hell is he doing to me in my sleep? I thought. I had made the decision to go to the police, but I needed evidence, or it was just my word against his. I purchased a hidden camera and set it up in the bedroom, pointing it towards the bed. I woke up the next day exhausted as usual, which unfortunately meant you had done something to me while I slept, but I had it on camera. I opened my laptop to check the footage. For the first couple of hours of sleep, nothing happened. For a moment I had hoped I was imagining everything until I watched myself jolt from the bed. At first I couldn't believe what I was doing. It felt like I was watching a horror movie as I watched myself crawl up the bedroom wall. Like some possessed demon, I continued to crawl up the wall onto the ceiling, looking down over Stephen, like I was ready to pounce on him. Stephen woke, and it was strange watching him because it was like he was prepared for what was happening and didn't seem fazed by it. He took out a stick out from under the bed as I bounced from the ceiling above, and he spent the next hour fighting me off. I watched as he subdued me on the bed before pulling out handcuffs and cuffing me to the bed. I looked at the marks on my wrists, which made sense now. As soon as Stephen came home from work, I ran and threw my arms around him. Why didn't you tell me what you were going through every night? Stephen shrugged his shoulders. I thought you knew, and usually the drugs I was giving you made things a little easier. Why are you even still with me? I said. My last girlfriend was a jealous psychopath. You're a walk in the park compared to her. I believe that was the highest rated story of the year. I've definitely read that one because I remember that twist getting me big time the first time round. That was a really well written story, and you definitely suspect Stephen's the bad guy, and then nope, she's a monster. Story number 2 now is titled, My Roommate Has Been in the Shower for More Than 4 Hours. So I got home around 11 PM. Late night at the office turned into an even later night at the bar. About 4 this point and I'm tired, just about ready to fall asleep as I stumble through the doorway. I lay down on the couch and reach for my bag of joints and spark one up as I pulled YouTube up on my laptop. I'm in the middle of watching some luxury cruise tour, close to passing out when I hear the front door open. I sit up and turn my head slightly, just enough to see my roommate coming in. He hangs his jacket in the closet and doesn't say anything and walks slowly to his room, which is normal enough. I'd been living with him for about 3 months, long enough for me to pick up on most of his tendencies. The guy really doesn't talk unless spoken to, which was far from a problem for me. He also generally kept things clean on his end, never causing much in the way of problems, so I couldn't complain. So I go back to watching YouTube, and about 5 minutes later I hear the shower in his room turning on. Once again, nothing strange. At this point I'm watching bare-knuckle boxing highlights with my eyes half open, maybe 1 or 2 minutes away from passing out. I remembered waking up in darkness, my head hurting, my throat dry as hell. I sat up slowly, waiting for the grogginess to settle into something manageable. Once it did, I grabbed my phone, checked the time. Around 3:30 AM from what I remember. I was starving, and so I got up, began walking towards the fridge, and then I noticed it. A soft but ever-present noise in the background. It took me a few seconds to really recognize what it was. The shower. Suddenly the events of last night began replaying in my head. Drinking at the bar, Ubering home, laptop, couch, my roommate coming home, and the shower turning on. I stood there for a while trying to make sense of it. Maybe he went to bed and forgot to turn it off. I shook my head. There's no way that happened, I thought. Maybe he slipped and fell. Realizing the implications of this, I rushed towards his room but found his bathroom door locked. I began pounding on it. "Hey man, you alright?" No response. I considered kicking the door down but decided to call 911 before I did that. Before I did that, I took my phone out. Preparing to dial when I noticed I had an unread text, one from my roommate. "Hey man, I couldn't sleep, so I went over to my girlfriend's place, not sure when I'll be back. Sent 2 hours ago." I look at the bathroom door, then back down at my phone. Everything about this was wrong. First of all, my roommate barely texts me, and certainly never to tell me that he's going out. Second of all, I know for a fact that he's single and has been for a while. And third of all, who was in the shower then? I tried calling him, no answer. Sent him some texts, but no response. I walked over to his desk and saw that his keys and wallet were still beside his laptop. My head's starting to spin at this point, and I get out of there, go back into the living room and turn on the lights. I'm pacing around in a circle, trying to follow the plot while also trying to ignore the shower, a noise that I never could have imagined being so dreadful in any context. Sometime later, I hear something vibrating on the kitchen counter. I move towards it and see that it's a phone. My roommate's phone. The panic begins setting in, and immediately I grab my keys and run out of the apartment. I make my way down the hall and take the stairs down to the lobby, but even that doesn't seem far enough away, and so I make my way over to the McDonald's across the street. McDonald's is safe, I like it. I sit there for a while considering calling the cops, but for some reason feeling too nervous to do so. But even though there's hardly anybody in there, the place begins to feel suffocating, and I decide to leave, walking back out onto the empty streets. Almost immediately I get this feeling that I'm being watched, and I feel my gaze drifting up and towards the apartment. Soon I'm looking at my balcony and I see someone standing there. A dark figure stood completely straight, stiff to the point where it nearly resembles a mannequin. But it isn't one. If I look closely, I can see it just slightly swaying. I froze in place, my mind hardly able to understand or accept anything it was seeing. It's not my roommate, it's too tall. In fact, it's too tall to be anybody I know. Its head nearly scraping the bottom of the balcony above. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make out any of its details. The darkness and distance may have been enough to explain that away, but there was something about it that drove me towards a different conclusion. That this thing simply possessed no details that could have been observed, that the only element of its composition was that of unadulterated darkness. Of course, my gut instinct was to get the hell away from it, but the voice in my head was telling me that if I were to try and run, this thing would end up following me. I went back into the McDonald's instead, locking myself in the bathroom as I finally dialed 911. I told the operator that somebody had broken into my place, but that I had gotten out of there without them noticing, but that they were still in there. It was the story that most accurately represented the situation, without making me come across as batshit. The operator told me they'd be sending somebody over for me to hang tight. I left the bathroom waiting at the table closest to the exit until I could see the red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. I went outside to meet the cops, looking up at the balcony to find it empty, though the door to the living room had been left open. They pelted me with a bunch of questions that I found difficult to answer. Is the intruder armed? Do I have an idea who it might be? What are their intentions? I told them I didn't know, that I couldn't figure it out, but they just kept on asking. Soon I was practically yelling at them to go up there and check it out for themselves, and I suppose the terror in my voice was enough for them to begin taking it seriously. They told me to wait by the entrance, and I watched on as they entered the building. I was out there for a long time, growing increasingly anxious at the thought of what they were going to tell me when they came down. A few minutes later, the silence was broken by a single, muffled gunshot. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I continued to wait there, unsure of what to do otherwise. 20 more minutes of silence, and the officers still hadn't come down. Soon I could hear more of them approaching in the distance. Before I knew it, 4 more cop cars had pulled up around me, and the scene had fallen into chaos. Officers shouting over each other and into their radios, more questions being hurled my way, none of which I was able to answer. The next few sequences were mostly a blur, but I remember the building being evacuated, the tenants frightened and confused as they were ushered outside, while the officers became more and more frantic. I remembered hearing more scattered gunshots, some screaming, other noises that were difficult to make sense of. There were a few lapses in my memory after that, but I recall being pushed into the back of a police car. After being driven to the station, I was led into one of the interrogation rooms, where I found 2 nondescript men in suits waiting for me. They didn't introduce themselves and immediately went into a series of questions. each one more bizarre than the last. What company was your roommate employed by? What was the nature of his job? How many different people have been inside your apartment since your roommate moved in? Have you ever heard voices inside the apartment from the hours of midnight to 3 a.m? Voices that did not belong to your roommate? Have you ever seen a circle of people standing outside of the apartment from the hours of midnight to 3 a.m? People that were exceptionally tall. And one of the most unsettling ones, have you ever seen somebody standing at the foot of your bed upon waking up between the hours of midnight to 3 a.m, only for them to disappear moments later? If so, do you remember what they looked like? Any distinct features? As they continued probing me, my mind began conjuring up some of the strange shit that had happened after my roommate had moved in. Shit that I had written off as figments of my imagination, simply because I had no other explanation for them. I did hear the voices, always coming from the room next to mine where my roommate slept. I was always so tired when I heard them, but I do remember it either sounded like a young woman or a man with an extremely deep voice. I could never make out any words, it always sounded like gibberish. And there was that one time where I went to the bathroom in the middle of the night, still half asleep. I didn't bother turning the lights on as I entered, but as my eyes adjusted to the dark, I could have sworn that somebody was already sitting on the toilet. Somebody extremely tall. Of course, when I turned on the lights, nothing was there, so it was easy to chalk it up as a product of late night drowsiness at the time, and I had never really thought about it since. After doing my best to give them some useful information, the suit spent a good few minutes taking notes on their phones. Once they were done, they sat up quickly, told me they'd be in touch before leaving the room. A cop came in a few minutes later and told me that since I couldn't return to the apartment, they would set me up in a nearby hotel until they were able to get the situation under control, and that I could stay put until they gave me a call. What happened? I asked him. What did you guys find up there? He stared at me for a long time, not as if he were deep in thought, but as if he held deep aversion for what he was considering telling me. Eventually he just shook his head. I don't know, he said. I really don't know. I nodded, tried to smile, though I'm sure it didn't come across very well. It's the next day now and I'm in the hotel. Of course I couldn't sleep, couldn't really eat. The officer hasn't called me yet. When I try searching up information about the evacuation on the internet, all I can find are articles claiming it was due to a fire. Update. I fell asleep and I just woke up. It's 1 a.m. now, and I can hear the shower. Damn. That was good, so I assume it's some kind of like cult business going on. I like that these like demon people like still need to do human things, like that tall demon thing was taking a shit. But has the courtesy to disappear when the light comes on. I like that. Story number 3 now is titled Dylan's Diary. Someone we didn't know tried to pick Dylan up from school today, said his elementary teacher. The guy said he was Dylan's older brother. Dylan doesn't have a brother, I said, alarmed. We thought so too, replied the teacher. I suspected something wasn't right straight away. It was this tall guy with black hair, looked in his late 30s, maybe even 40. He knew your address, Dylan's full name and birthday, and which class he was in. I went inside to check with the principal, but when I came back, the guy was gone. was silent for a second as I stood facing the teacher outside the school gate. The gate separated the main road and a large playground and basketball court leading into the school. All the other kids and parents had left and we were the only ones standing outside. "Where's Dylan now?" I asked. "He's waiting for you in the principal's office," she said, gesturing for me to follow as she turned around. I walked across the playground behind her shakily, then through the corridors to the office. My 8-year-old son Dylan sat on the couch in the principal's office, still as a stone. The principal sat behind her desk and there was a cop standing next to her. "Hey buddy," I said, "are you okay?" Dylan looked at me blankly. My Dylan was always a quiet boy. It was just the two of us at home at the time. I was a single dad. My late wife Angie, Dylan's mother, died a year prior. She'd been hit by a car while cycling around a sharp bend and they never identified the driver. I won't go into any more detail here, as frankly I'd rather not relive that period, but safe to say it destroyed me. I tried to pick up the pieces and stay strong for Dylan. Was I doing a good job? Only God knows. I received no feedback. Since then, Dylan became even more withdrawn, pretty much remaining silent until spoken to. He was seen by a child psychologist and various other members of the welfare team at school, but after assessment they were sure he didn't have autism or the like. He could speak up when he was pressed. He was just shy and preferred to keep to himself. The cop confirmed I was Dylan's dad, then asked me a few questions. He finally told us they'd try and find the guy and to report if we ever saw him again. The principal and teacher said a few things, but it was a blur. All I remember is sweating profusely with my knees shaking, trying to comprehend the fact that someone had tried to kidnap my son. "Dylan, you didn't know that man, did you?" asked the principal. Dylan shook his head. I was on edge after that day. Dylan was my whole world, all the family I had left, and I couldn't stand the possibility that he could be in danger. It made me sick. Who was this man and why my son? Did he know us or was it some random creep? I always walked Dylan to and from school thereafter and was never late to pick him up again. Meanwhile, Dylan himself didn't seem rattled in the slightest. He never mentioned the incident unless specifically asked. At the time I thought he was just timid and didn't want to cause trouble. A couple of weeks later, after the incident, the same homeroom teacher called me during her lunch break. She said one of the kids in her class saw Dylan talking to a man through the school fence. When she rushed out, the man was gone. When Dylan was asked about it, he said he hadn't been talking to anyone. The girl who apparently spotted him was questioned further, and she was adamant she saw Dylan talking to a tall, lanky man with messy black hair. The cops were called again, did a quick search of the perimeter of the school, but they found nobody suspicious. That afternoon, I sat Dylan down at the kitchen table. "I won't get angry, I just need you to tell me the truth," I said, trying to steady my nerves. "Did you or didn't you talk to a stranger today at school, yes or no?" He shrugged. Getting an answer out of him was harder than drawing blood from a stone. "How many times have we told you not to talk to strangers? It's for your own safety. You do understand that, don't you, son?" He nodded, looking slightly afraid. I realised I had raised my voice and felt guilty immediately. Exasperated and running on 2 hours of sleep, I left him at the dining table and went straight to bed. That night, I woke at 2 a.m. and went for a bathroom trip. I decided to check on Dylan while I was at it. He wasn't in his room. I called out his name and looked around as the seconds ticked by. I checked wardrobes, corners, even in cupboards which made no sense to look in as he'd never fit in them, but I was desperate, thinking he'd been kidnapped. I went into the street, yelling his name as I ran up and down it like a maniac. As I came back into the house ready to call the police, I looked in Dylan's room for one last check. He was sitting up on his bed, wide awake and staring back at me. "Where were you?" I asked, relieved but still alarmed. "I was here," he replied. "No, you weren't. I was looking everywhere for you and you weren't in here." "I was." Had I just imagined all of that? I shook my head, feeling a migraine coming on. "Just stay in your room, okay? Don't scare me." I thought my eyes had deceived me somehow and the paranoia was getting to me. Perhaps I should have paid attention to the fact that the window was wide open. About a year after those incidents, I heard a knock on my apartment door. I was inside doing some paperwork while Dylan was in his room playing Minecraft. I was on alert immediately. No one ever knocked on the door. We lived in a block of apartments and friends or acquaintances would always wait outside the main door, ring the doorbell, and I would greet them downstairs. This meant it was likely an upstairs or downstairs neighbour who needed something. I had a few of their numbers from when we moved in for contact should the need ever arise, but we weren't close at all. I wondered what could be the problem. I walked up to the door and looked outside the peephole. There was no one there. Odd, I thought. Perhaps I'd heard something. Those random occurrences were commonplace now, and second-guessing myself was just my nature at that point. As I walked back to my desk in the living room, I heard another knock. Something was up. I walked up to the door again. No one seen through the peephole. Was someone pranking us? I stood just behind the door and texted my upstairs neighbour, asking him if he'd knocked on the door. A few moments later, I heard footsteps upstairs that went in the direction of the door, then hurriedly back into the apartment. I then received a text back about a minute later. "Do not open the door. There's a guy with a huge knife crouching, hiding right next to your door." My phone buzzed again, another text from my upstairs neighbour. "Calling cops right now, stay inside." I froze as all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was paralysed for a few seconds. When I came to my senses, I tiptoed to Dylan's room. "Stay inside, keep quiet," I whispered, my eyes bulging, beads of sweat dripping down my forehead. I'd never felt my heart beat so fast. Dylan looked up and raised his eyebrows as I shut his door slowly and stood outside it, about to throw up. We were so still that I could make out quiet but frantic talking upstairs and more rushing footsteps. I read my upstairs neighbour's text again to make sure my eyes hadn't deceived me. I tiptoed to the kitchen and grabbed one of my own kitchen knives, then returned to the same spot outside Dylan's room. Anticipating a crazed psycho busting down the door at any second, I chanted manic prayers for safety on repeat in my head. Not a sound came from inside his room. After what seemed like years, I heard sirens in the distance and my heart rate started to slow a little. My grip on the knife handle loosened. Eventually I heard some shouting, more footsteps and banging that gradually faded in volume. "This is the police," shouted a voice. I looked through the peephole to confirm that it was a cop, then opened the door, knife still in hand. They They were very reassuring and informed us that a tall, lanky man with black hair had just been apprehended and taken into police custody. He had knocked on my door and was waiting for someone inside to open it. He was indeed waiting with a freshly sharpened knife. What was he going to do with it to the first person that opened that door, which was going to be me? Well, if it isn't obvious, then your guess is as good as mine. This guy's name was Gregory. He seemed to bounce around from place to place with no permanent address, even travelling between states and doing petty crimes like theft, harassment, and occasionally stalking minors. When they did a more thorough research, it turns out he had been involved in at least one gruesome murder in a different state, and ended up being given a life sentence for it, along with his accomplices. I wouldn't have wished that terror upon anyone, but these unfortunate things happen. The side effects of the psychological damage I experienced that day have never left me. However, I know people who have been through similar horrors, but never lived to tell the tale. So I looked on the bright side and counted myself lucky. Where there are sick freaks, there will be victims. The sicko was in jail, and I thought that was the end of it. But there was a different side to the story that I only uncovered 10 years after the incident. Dylan was due to leave for college, living away from home for the first time. He had grown into a tall kid with a surprising number of friends, still obedient but relentlessly quiet. While packing his things and clearing out his room, I found a rugged-looking old notebook at the back of his bottom drawer. Dylan's diary, said the cover. I flicked through it with no intention to pry initially, and saw that he had written and drawn in it extensively, with impressively neat handwriting. He had always been a boy of few words, so I was intrigued. I began reading the first page. Page 1. Cody's house, 11 a.m. He has to give me back my coat. There were a few stick figure drawings. Page 2. I need a book for English class next week. Ask if Amy has one. I turned the pages, and the first few were filled with the same mundane elementary school day-to-day affairs, mixed in with a few doodles. Then I got to page 21. Page 21. Why does my dad talk so much? He won't even let me get an Xbox, and he won't let me sleep over at Cody's house. Talking back is no use. I hate him. I felt a sting and my heart sank. I remembered that day vividly, and a pang of guilt ran through me. I turned to the page. Page 22. Saw Greg today. He says he can help me get rid of Dad. I said he was lying, but he says he's done it before. It was in the news. As my mind connected the dots, I flicked through the previous pages. This was the first mention of Greg I could find. I started to sweat but continued reading. Page 23. Me and Greg are coming up with a plan. Need Dad gone, but I almost got caught talking to him today. Mrs. Watford, that stupid mole rat, kept asking me. She took me to the principal's office again. I think Katie saw Greg and snitched. Need to be careful. A few blank pages with a few in between filled with scribbles and admin type notes to self. Then the narrative continued. Page 41, the word plan was underlined, with 2 drawings underneath. The first was of a stick figure kneeling by a door holding what looked like a dagger. This stick figure was smiling. There was another stick figure behind the door with its hand on the door handle about to open it. The second was of the first stick figure stabbing the stick man who had opened the door. his eyes now 2 crosses. Page 42. Greg came to my house and I showed him my plan. He said it was good and he could do it. We almost got caught by Dad, but I got back in bed just in time. He's gonna get some tools from his house. Close one. Page 43. Greg screwed up. He's in jail now. Why did Dad not open the door when Greg knocked? Everything went wrong. I don't know why. Page 44. I wish my dad would just shut up. I flicked through the rest of the notebook, which was blank. Page 44 was the last entry. I read the entries a few times and pondered what I should do. I never thought Dylan was capable of such heinous intentions. Confused and upset, I acted as if nothing had happened for a few days. But on the day he was due to leave for college, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I brought his duffel bag down and hooked it on his suitcase. He was ready to head to the station, standing outside the door with the suitcase and his backpack. Dylan, when you were younger, did I ever say or do anything that hurt you? You can be honest with me. No, why do you ask? He replied. I held up the diary. He froze for a second, and I saw the colour drain from his face. I won't blame you for anything, don't worry. You know I love you very much, son. You were a minor and you were a victim of a very sick man. Besides, this thing is years old. I just wanted to know what I did wrong at the time to lead to this, and we can put it behind us. His shocked expression faded, leaving his ever-present blank stare. You didn't do anything wrong. Neither did Mom. I opened my mouth to ask him what he meant by that, but stopped. The corners of his mouth stretched into a wide smile. Our eyes met and we stood in silence for a few seconds. Dylan, if I were to find another one of these notebooks, I began tactfully, would I see the blueprint of my wife's murder inside? Yeah, he didn't even pause to answer. Then he gripped the handle of his suitcase and walked off down the street. That was 2 years ago now. I never forgave him. Every night I still lie awake thinking whether he was born that way or it's somehow my fault. We haven't talked since he left that day and he hasn't come back home. He's never tried to contact me and I haven't likewise. It looks like he's doing well in college from his Facebook posts. He seems to have a lot of friends, so I assume he got his own place or stays with one of them. I wonder if any of them will ever find out who he really is. Wouldn't blame them if they never do. After all, I still don't know who my son is, and I raised him for 18 years. That was insanely good. What a good twist. What a really good twist. So creepy. The issue is, can't really go to the police unless he found that other diary, which I imagine the fact that Dylan was so quick to own up to it is either destroyed or well hidden, but that is terrifying. I'd just be worried he was going to come back at any given moment to finish the job, pretty much. Yeah, that was terrifying. This story is titled Stay in Your Vehicle. Back in April of 2013, I went through something that I haven't been able to talk about. I was paid a significant amount of money to stay quiet in return for signing a 10-year agreement to shut the hell up. Now that the time is up, I've considered my options. I could just let this go and never speak of it again. I won't gain anything from speaking out, and I got a lot to lose, but then again, This is just an anonymous post online. West Virginia. It was hotter than usual, without a whiff of wind. I was coming home from a visit to my aunt. She'd broken her leg and couldn't leave her house. I was making my way home, taking the I-64 out of Lewisburg. It started with the radio. It was playing that one Macklemore song I'd heard 100 times over. The sound was cutting in and out in a quick staccato, then disappeared completely. I could hear cars honking up front as the line began to form. There was a sway in the trees as if greater and greater pressure was being put on them. I could hear wind rushing against the left side of the car, forcing me to pull the other way to compensate. I closed the sunroof as a dust cloud blew past, staining the windshield. Then a rumble. It sounded like thunder, but from the ground, like a groaning bellow, growing louder and clearer by the second. As it reached its peak, I could see trees toppling over. A small Kia got pushed off balance and swerved off the road. As the sound died down, the road developed into chaos. Some were desperately changing lanes, others were stepping on the brakes. I got my door scraped as the car behind me sped past. The radio was playing an automated message, a local emergency alert referred to as a geological event, where we were asked to turn off all air conditioning, slow down and divert to the nearest exit. It repeated in a monotone voice, geological event, no air conditioning, slow down, divert to nearest exit. Minutes passed. There was a line forming further down the road, police officers blocking the lanes in all directions, leaving a highway exit as the only option. Some folks were trying to push past the barricades but were forced back at gunpoint. I could see officers wearing gas masks and riot shields. We were waved in. I followed the exit and got directed to the right. There was an open field that was used as a sort of impromptu parking lot. Cars were being waved in and parked in a way that boxed us in, leaving no room for us to open our doors in either direction unless we got parked at the edge. 4 lines of cars with about 10 to 15 vehicles per line. Surplus vehicles were directed further down the road. The place was packed, and I got stuck in the second row about 6 cars in. Pretty much everyone around me were on their phones. I didn't have anyone to call, but there seemed to be an issue getting a signal through. The radio was still repeating the emergency message. Voices were getting louder. A man 2 cars to my left leaned out of a cab in the door, screaming at the officers to answer his question. They responded immediately with a warning shot straight into the air. "Stay in your vehicle," they screamed. "Lock your doors, I'm not telling you again." A couple of folks were filming, but there seemed to be trouble uploading. We were losing bandwidth. It didn't take long until phone signals were completely blocked. I think a video or 2 of that officer firing into the air made it online. They were patrolling back and forth. We were told to stay in our vehicles, windows up, doors closed and locked, engines off. I could hear people talking in the other cars. Someone said there'd been a natural gas leak from the geological event, and that combustible engines could spark an explosion. Others were talking about a terrorist attack. There were no answers, and the officers weren't eager to talk. After about an hour, things were getting ugly. People were hungry, thirsty, restless. One officer stepped up on the front cars, handing out water bottles, crackers, and processed cheese slices. He had to step from one car to another, denting the hoods with his steel-tipped shoes. seat, pulled down my cap and tried to relax. I'd been playing some games on my phone, but the battery was running low and I wanted to save some, so I settled for a nap instead. The sweat was stinging my eyes, not because of how warm it was, but because of how nervous I was. No matter what I did, I felt trapped, and the car felt smaller and smaller. I couldn't get out of it if I wanted to, and it physically hurt me to think about how little control I had. Is that what claustrophobia feels like? A couple of officers were discussing something by the front line. One of them had a white cotton glove on, which he used to wipe off the hood of one of the front cars. The glove was taken off and put into a bag, which in turn was sealed with a hot air gun. I was getting the impression that our cars had been covered in something. I wasn't the only one considering it. There were 2 college kids in the car to my left and they were discussing it too. Anthrax, one of them said. Gotta be. Nah, gold dust, the other chuckled. They don't want to share. You know what? The first groaned, I honest to God hope you're right. You're not, but I hope you are. I joined in the conversation shortly after. I offered another explanation. Something combustible. Something that might blow up if we started our cars. They were willing to consider this. The car behind me couldn't hear us, but the driver held up a notebook with the text. If we don't know what, it's gotta be aliens. I couldn't tell if they were serious, but they weren't laughing about it. A man in his 50s and what looked like his daughter. There were a couple of other folks in the other cars. A man in a black shirt, sort of like a preacher without a collar. 2 middle-aged women with a kid in the back seat. A fat man blaring Johnny Cash from his stereo. A couple with a teenage son who couldn't stop drumming on the windows. We'd been stuck for about 2, maybe 2.5 hours, when a truck rolled in. One of those with a large water tank. It was unmarked, looked civilian. As it rolled in, they were calling out on the megaphone. We'll be hosing your vehicles down, they said. Keep everything locked and closed. Then we'll be covering your vehicle with protective plastic while we wait for it to dry. After that, we'll start letting you go in an orderly manner. I repeat, ... Most of us were relieved. It was only a matter of time now and it was getting dark. They were getting up on the cars, hosing them down thoroughly. It smelled of chlorine, so maybe they'd mix something into the water. As they came to my car, they stepped up on it and double-checked the sunroof, making sure it was locked and secured. They sprayed down the car, bathing it in its chemical stink, the kind that gets stuck to the back of your throat. It took a long time for them to finish, at least an hour or 2. After that, they were rolling out a kind of plastic cover at the short side of the lot, the kind that you use to protect balls or rain covers for football fields. They used 2 squad cars to slowly drape the thing over the entire lot, securing the edges with large rocks. Please stay calm, they called out as the plastic crawled over us. I know this is uncomfortable, but this is for your own safety. Once the cleaning is done, you will be free to go. Stay inside your vehicle at all times. I did as I was told. I stayed inside and I watched that plastic cover sweep over me. It felt like getting buried alive. All lights went out, leaving me in complete darkness, accompanied only by the vague, disembodied voices of the others. The college kids were talking about where they were going to go after this. Someone was honking, not sure if it was to show support or discontent. Someone else was cheering. I took my last swig of water, washing down my final plain cracker. I got back in the driver's seat. I could hear as they finished moving the plastic cover and parking their squad vehicles. I waited patiently impatiently, figuring it'd maybe be another hour or so. They hadn't really given us a timeline, but I could breathe a little easier. I was going back and forth between feeling empowered with my hands on the wheel and feeling like I was stuck in a metal coffin. It was so dark and everything smelled of plastic and chemicals, like a car wash stuck in time. As the excitement died down, I paid more attention to the background sounds. I tried to filter out the various discussions from the nearby cars, and somewhere in the distance I heard raised voices. It wasn't coming from the cars, but the officers. Whatever they were talking about, it was a heated discussion. An hour came and went, and people were getting impatient. More cars were honking, others yelling, demanding answers. I couldn't get my leg to stop shaking. The more I thought about getting out of here, the smaller the car felt. I was hyper-focusing on things I couldn't control. I was a little thirsty and out of water. Needed to use the bathroom. I wanted to stretch my legs and go for a walk. I wanted to breathe the fresh air and get that awful chemical taste out of my mouth. I heard a car starting, accelerating. The truck was moving somewhere off to the side. "We need you to stay in your vehicle," a voice screamed over the megaphone. "Do not leave for any reason. Stay in your vehicle." Cars speeding off, not many but a couple, then quiet. The officers left us there. Everyone was quiet. A couple of folks had opened up their phones, using them as flashlights to look from car to car, looking out at the sea of vehicles, all of us trapped under that dark cover. I could see a handful of lights cut off by sharp silhouettes. I couldn't make out who was who in the dark. It was all just people, anonymous. I heard a gasp somewhere in the back. There was a metallic clunk, like when the officers climbed atop our cars to get us our water. There was a careful cheer as some folks figured they were taking off the plastic cover. But that wasn't it. Instead, there were more footsteps. The cheers slowly died down as more and more footsteps pattered across our cars. I stopped counting after a dozen. The silhouettes in the other cars were still. We all held our breaths, waiting for an answer to show itself. What the hell was going on? Somewhere off to my right, I heard a voice. "Who's up there?" It sounded like an older man. I'd seen a pickup truck that way earlier. Almost as a response, the footsteps stopped. There was a faint clicking sound, like someone snapping their tongue against the roof of their mouth. Click, click. And from further away, a click in response. From somewhere to my left, another couple clicks. Then a cascade of clicks, dozens, maybe hundreds. There was an awful metallic noise coming from my right, then breaking glass, a scream cut short, followed by several irregular taps of the car horn. One of the silhouettes in the distance turned into a blur as something passed through the windshield, cutting through the plastic cover. Somewhere in the front row, the roof of a car was cut wide open. Someone was pulled up out of their seat. 2 cars back from where I was, there was more glass breaking. It sounded like a wild animal got in. I could see a weak hint of red splatter against the passenger window. I wasn't getting any air. I could feel my heart beating through my chest as my arms started shaking. My hands were cramped around the steering wheel and I felt sweat dripping down my shoulders. I couldn't control it. I didn't even see what was going on, but these sounds, these screams, they awakened something primal. This was danger, a threat. My body knew long before I did. The college kids in the other car were ducking down. One of them waved a hand at me as if telling me to get down, and I nodded. back seat. I couldn't see where I was putting my hands or feet. Everything is different in the dark. As I tumbled my way over, my foot accidentally tapped the car horn. It was a quick tap, a fraction of a second, but to me it was the loudest sound in the world. I was lying on my stomach in the back seat, and within seconds something heavy climbed onto the hood of my car. I could feel the car buckling. It was much heavier than the man who'd passed out water bottles. I held my hands in front of my mouth to stop the panting, but I ended up snorting up sweat instead. My nose stung as I bit my tongue, listening to every metallic groan as whatever was outside moved and shifted. Click, click, and from behind my car a click in response. There were no lights being held up anymore. Everyone was cowering, going quiet. I pushed myself up against the door behind the driver's seat, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear the frame of the car complain as something slowly moved. When it came to my sunroof, there was a slight crack. That made it stop. Another crack. I silently shook my head as if trying to ask the car to stop. That thing was going to break, and it did. My legs were showered with glass as a big blob of plastic cover dipped into my car. Something big came tumbling into the front seat, still covered in protective plastic. It twitched and spun around, its clicking turning from a careful question-like noise to a never-ending barrage. It was calling for help, alerting others, and it was cutting its way through the plastic. There were footsteps coming from every direction, some of them leaping from car to car, some of them leaping far enough to skip a car as they hurried. I was going to be swarmed within seconds. I fumbled with my hands, accidentally cutting my thumb on the broken glass. I managed to open the passenger side door, but even at its widest, and even when pressing into the college kid's car, there wasn't enough room to get out. Still, I had to try. I pressed myself into the cab and exhaled as much as I could, flattening my chest. While the thing thrashed around inside of my car, I could feel my vision going faint. Black spots popped up at the edge of my vision, my arms going weak, and yet by some miracle I made it through. As my face hit the gravel of the makeshift parking lot, I felt the burn of residual chemicals. I swallowed my instinct to run, instead staying on my stomach, forcing myself to crawl under my car. There were more of them, some climbing on, some off. My chest was pressed to the ground as the weight shifted. I heard a breaking glass from the windshield and tearing fabric. Something was stuck up there and it was furious, like a trapped animal. I could hear the college kids mumbling to one another, trying to stay calm, one assuring the other that all they had to do was stay low, stay quiet, and wait. Then something slammed into the passenger side door, the one I'd crawled out of. The door was pressed up against the neighbouring car, then fell haphazardly to the ground, completely off the hinges. An ink-black, bird-like foot touched the ground next to me. I've looked it up since. There were 3 toes forward, 1 toe backward, all clawed. Anisodactyl feet, similar to that of many birds of prey, except larger than a human foot and with smooth, slick skin. It must have been heavy, or at least 400 pounds. If the clicking sound came from its mouth, I can approximate that it was somewhere around 6'7" to 6'9", or taller. It could have been hunched over. How it managed to walk in the gap between the vehicles is beyond me, but I suspect it was very thin. It daintily walked from my car to the others as if scanning for something. I could barely see anything in the dark, but this thing seemed to navigate it perfectly, and it didn't bump into anything. There was a tap on the glass of the car behind me to my right, and someone got startled. A short scream the side of the car next to them, and off in the distance there was gunfire, just a couple of shots. The college kids in the car next to me slammed their doors open and followed my lead. They rolled onto the ground and under their car. There was a little more light coming in as the cover had been torn above. Their faces were red from tears, and one of them was desperately trying to call for help on his phone. The other grabbed the phone out of his hand. A short scuffle ensued, ending with them putting on a ringtone and sliding the thing as far to the left as they could. Whatever car that phone landed under was demolished, every window broken, every passenger gone. I could hear the grinding as a seat was ripped into and thrown away. In a matter of seconds, an entire vehicle was torn to pieces as dozens of those things swarmed it. "Shut up," one of the college kids repeated. "Shut up, shut up, shut up." Something reached under my car. It scraped against the sole of my shoe, tearing a hole all the way to my big toe. I hurried forward, scurrying like a lizard. The college kids noticed and followed suit. I don't think they thought about it too much, it was just movement and they went for it. I made it 2 cars down before I got stuck. There was something dark in the way, and I couldn't get around it without exposing myself. I couldn't see what it was, but it didn't take long for me to figure it out. There was a meaty crunch, as if someone was biting chunks out of a piece of meat. It was struggling to get through the fabric of their clothes, making a snapping noise as threads gave way. A pool of blood rolled under the car, staining the tip of my fingers. It was still warm. One of those things were eating a victim. I hungered down, trying to remember to breathe, and I stayed there waiting for a chance. Any chance. I must have stayed there for at least an hour, hearing every bite, every crack of bone, satisfied clicking noises. As it finished its meal, it wandered off, dragging the remains along. They were moving forward. Something heavy walked over the car I was hiding under, dragging a body along. Slowly the footsteps disappeared. It was quiet again, and in that quiet I found my footing. I made my way to the edge of the plastic cover. I listened one final time, pushed one of the weights away, and I slipped through. They were gone and I was out. I could feel my chest growing lighter, allowing me to breathe. I wanted to cry from relief. A breeze was picking up, drying the sweat on my brow and carrying the smell of grass. Stepping back, I turned towards the sea of cars to see how bad the damage was. And then I saw one. It was a bit off to the side, perching on top of an old Honda. At a glance it looked like a tall person covered in a slick black ink. But looking closer you could see the strange bird-like feet, the pointed nails, the long row of shark-like teeth on a mouth that was far too wide. I froze. The thing rose to its full length, easily over 7 feet tall, and it looked ready to pounce on me. I had nothing to defend myself with. I couldn't make any sudden moves. I couldn't even be halfway under the car before that thing would be over me. 100 thoughts raced through my mind, but there was nothing I could do. I was out of options, but the thing just looked at me. It raised a slice of raw meat, blood dripping onto the plastic cover. It looked at me curiously, taking a bite. Then, as if nothing had happened, it wandered off. I was left there shaking like a dry leaf, and with the last of those things gone, all that was left was the panic. It didn't take long for the officers to return. The plastic cover was removed, but we couldn't go home. Not after this. Some folks signed a waiver and were let go immediately. They weren't allowed to talk about what they'd seen, and in return they'd get a hefty sum of insurance money. Others demanded answers and were taken into custody for obstruction of justice. few others were still too panicked to make any kind of sense and had to be checked out by medical personnel. A total of 14 people died. It was described by a combination of causes: a traffic pile-up, carbon monoxide poisoning, animal attack. I think there was something about an escaped convict too. Excuses all over the place, and the times were all wrong, spread out for a couple of days to more smoothly blend into accidents statistics. And if you wanted to go home and get your insurance money, you had to sign a non-disclosure. I did too. I know the college kids did as well. Goddamn miracle they made it out, but I saw them. 34 cars had to be towed, 18 people wounded, 6 seriously so. 4 people lost at least one limb. One guy had an arm ripped off halfway up his collarbone, and I don't know how he survived. Most people never saw those things up close. They just remember the screams and the breaking glass. Sometimes at night that's all I hear too. Closing my eyes reminds me of lying under those cars, feeling the pressure as the weight shifted. I still get trouble breathing. I think a part of me is still stuck there. It stayed in my vehicle. Wow. What a fantastically written story to finish the night with. I feel like we've had some proper scary ones, but that one wasn't so much scary, more of just like a captivating read. I'm assuming it was like dinosaur vibes kind of thing. Very cool. Yeah, really well written, and I think an appropriate place to end this video. So I really hope you've enjoyed this Scary Stories video, and that you've enjoyed them throughout the year. If you enjoyed and you're able to, then please do give this video a like.